On side proposition, we oppose the use of facial recognition technology by supermarkets, as well as any other means of technology which massively infringes upon individual privacy. If the problem of the debate is shoplifting, there are countless other measures which we can use, which have proven to be incredibly effective. We'll use the massive amounts of monetary and political capital required to heighten other less controversial security measures, like using barcode detectors which sound an alarm whenever an item unpaid for leaves the store, similar to how a library works, by the way, increasing staff patrols, locking up expensive items like watches and laptops behind glass panels, etc. We'll also have existing means to find and locate guilty individuals, for example, CCTVs around the store. But crucially, the reason why we think CCTVs are fine, but facial recognition technology is not, is because CCTV footage can only be accessed when there's reasonable suspicion by state officials against a suspect and probable cause, whereas this facial recognition technology, by definition, is used and maintained by a third party, just a supermarket in this case. I'm going to talk about two things. One on backlash, second on abuse and discrimination, and my second speaker will talk about cost. First substantive then, this policy, regardless of how well it works, will engender massive backlash against the supermarket. This argument assumes the best case scenario on their side, that this technology will not be abusive and discriminatory, which, as our next substantive will prove, is highly unlikely. But this assumes that even if this technology is perfect, it will cause massive public outcry. Why? This technology intrinsically requires the collection and analysis of all face data from every single customer going in. Opposition can't just assert that you'll only collect the criminals' faces, because by virtue of the fact that in order to identify who the criminal is, you'll need to get access to everyone's face data to match it up to. So this causes massive data privacy risk. I'll elaborate on that later in my second substantive. But for now, this will result in massive displeasure and rejection of this technology, because people never just consent to face recognition technology for fun. There's an incredibly high burden of proof and immense need required for an entity when it calls for the collection of user biometric data. For example, TSA checks, so terrorists don't just bring a bomb onto the into the United States or cause another 9/11. The problem is, not only are the stakes low in this case, for example, I stole some meat from the supermarket to feed my family versus an airplane crashing and killing thousands of people in the World Trade Center. Supermarkets have at least 1,000 other ways to make sure people don't steal, as highlighted in our introduction, which means this is probable to cause massive societal upheaval and anger. Just imagine, I want to get some broccoli to cook a meal for my family, and I have to go through a whole face scan process for them to make sure I'm not a criminal, and I don't know where the data is going. It might be sold to whatever company for the supermarket to gain profit. And furthermore, there's massive amounts of societal distrust around third-party organizations getting access to facial recognition data. This can be seen in how WorldCoin, an organization planning to collect human iris data, faced massive rejection and backlash, and was outlawed in many nations. This can also be seen in how there was massive friction in the adoption of Face ID, if you remember, even though the company distributing it was Apple, a trusted company for many years. Now imagine Apple not taking care of this user data responsibly, but a random supermarket doing God knows what with it. The public will likely be justifiably incredibly skeptical about how well the data is managed, to what extent the data is safe, to what extent is this supermarket legitimate, etc. The nuance of this argument is that the data may be safe, but because humans are intrinsically risk-averse creatures, there's a natural tendency to believe that it's not. So this will lead to massively negative outcomes for the supermarket, because people have ceased to visit the supermarket, the worst case, and turn to other supermarkets or online shopping, maybe boycott its products, and lead to massive economic harms, of which all can be avoided if we avoided this divisive technology. Second argument on how this creates massive propensity for abuse and discrimination. Two tiers to this argument. One, on data privacy. Insofar as this system is collecting massive amounts of personal data, which is very valuable in the information age, by the way, it creates opportunities for bad faith actors to use it in unsavory and evil ways. So large corporations may be incentivized to sell their customers' personal data to boost profits. Like many tech companies already do this. For example, Facebook sells your data, Google sells your data, Amazon sells your data. And even with backlash, it's still a practice that continues to be pervasive in the entire industry because companies are inherently profit incentivized and they don't really care about your data as long as they can make profit. And second tier to this is that it creates and entrenches stereotypes and discriminates against ex-offenders. So we think it's utterly horrible and perverse that this system can pick up someone who has been an ex-offender for 30 years and subject him to more checks, or even ban him outright from going grocery shopping. This system systematically and inherently subjects further stigma to ex-offenders, which we think is unjust, because many people who did something as insignificant as robbing a supermarket will be forever subject to that stigma whenever their face elicits a beep on the facial recognition system. Imagine this, I walk in a supermarket and see some guy having to go through 5 minutes of checks and it beeping whenever he walks by the facial recognition gantry. I'm naturally going to be suspicious of him, even if he was only an offender 30 years ago. And furthermore, the datasets on which these systems operate are also very, very highly questionable because of its customizability. Note that in motion says the supermarket's individual store record. If the supermarket manager is racist, for example, and he pardons white kids who steals, but imprints the mugshots of black teenagers into his system, this legitimizes discrimination using this technology. Because whereas before, it is clearly racist to turn away a black person just because he's black, now this face recognition technology gives reason and legitimacy towards such a horrible action because this person stole some fruits 5 years ago. We think that's absolutely horrible. At the end of this, just going to elaborate on, review what I've already said. Note then that opposition can't just, because we prevent massive backlash and economic harm, because we prevent abuse and discrimination by large corporations selling your data, we prevent racism. So proud to propose. Thank you.
Imagine this. Imagine a world where once you step inside to an environment such as a supermarket, a communal place, and you feel unsafe. You feel like this place, past people have experiences with sexual assault. Past people have experiences with kidnapping. Past people have experiences with shooting. We believe that this debate is not just about shoplifting. We believe that it is on a much larger scale than that. But before I get into my substantives, I'd like to start with a few rebuttals. First of all, like I've mentioned, the word shoplifting, or what side government has largely extended their case on, is not entirely what this debate is about. We believe that crimes that occur inside supermarkets can be much more than just shoplifting, right? And it can also be much more dangerous and much more much more unjust to these environments. And it may be harder to track as well, right? Furthermore, we believe that supermarkets aren't likely to sell data because having facial recognition is just like sensitive data. It isn't data that is going to be useful for other groups in the future. I'll take that later. Okay, first off, I like to start my substantives, right? What we believe this looks like, or what we believe our case looks like, is that individuals will be heavily monitored. Criminals will be heavily monitored to make sure that they are not committing any further crimes in the supermarket, right? This does not mean that immediately once they enter the supermarket, they'll be banned from it. This means that they'll just have staffs monitoring them from the CCTV, for example, just to make sure that these people aren't committing further crimes. Also, this will also mean that supermarkets will have to announce the technology will be implemented ahead of time to make sure that the people entering their stores will be informed of this decision that they are making. And furthermore, if they are caught committing these crimes, they will be caught and then they will be banned from the supermarket accordingly. However, we believe that this policy does not look like people going to the supermarket and taking 5 minutes to have facial recognition. What we believe this looks like is we believe this looks like people walking into the market and having a CCTV-like technology that allows the supermarket to recognize these faces and monitor whether or not these people are criminals. Next, I'd like to define what crime means in general, just to make sure we get a better understanding of this on the debate, right? We believe that crime isn't just like petty theft, but we also believe that it can be things that are much more dangerous or much more traumatic, such as sexual assault, kidnapping, pickpocketing, or even shooting.
Information.
Yes, I take that now.
Why do you think shootings happen in a large majority of supermarkets as compared to shoplifting?
What we're saying is that we by using facial recognition, we're ensuring that all there are less repeated offenses, and we're ensuring that all sorts of criminal cases will be monitored heavily. This also means that there will be more crime preventions against these more dangerous and more traumatic crimes. Okay, currently in our status quo, we believe that it is hard to catch criminals, and we believe that facial recognition is an easy way to ensure that the process will be easier. It's also a way for staff and workers of the supermarket to know who to look out for. And furthermore, we also agree on both sides that facial recognition is commonly used, such as on iPhone, on Apple, or like through Facebook. And we believe that these people still continuously use these devices. It does not mean that they're going to completely stop using your phones or these applications, right? And at the end of the day, I want you to understand that the end goal is to create a safer and more protected environment for all individuals, which means that there will be less crimes. And it is important that we ensure facial recognition in supermarkets, because supermarkets are a shared communal place for all groups of people. So we want to ensure the safety of all groups. Onto my two arguments, which are one, crime prevention, and second, which my DLO will be talking about, is why it's justified and a safer supermarket. Okay, first off, on crime prevention, right? We believe that the main problem of this is that it is hard to catch criminals because there are no records, and it's a harder way to spot who is really a criminal and who isn't, simply just from like barcode scanning or simply just from CCTV, right? And we also believe that facial recognition makes it easier for these supermarket staffs to spot these criminals and these individuals. And this does not mean that they're going to get discriminated against, or this does not mean that they're immediately going to be banned from the supermarket. They're just going to be closely monitored until they do something bad again, or until they get caught, in which they will be banned from the supermarket, right? We believe that by having this facial recognition, it results in more aware staffs. Staffs know when the criminal are inside the supermarket, so they know that they should be prepared in case a crime occurs, and they should also know that and they will be more well equipped compared to these staffs knowing about this situation after the crime has occurred already, right? This also creates a safer environment for people, for individuals. Therefore, I believe that individuals would more likely, or there's a higher likelihood for these individuals to want to live in a safe environment versus never like get their face recognized by a supermarket, right? As individuals, we facially recognize if we believe that once it is monitored and once nothing bad happens, then these criminals won't feel threatened by it, or these criminals just then won't take offense to it if simply nothing happens. So therefore, we believe that it doesn't cause any harms towards any types of individuals, right? Furthermore, as individuals know that they are monitored, they are less likely to commit crimes such as SA in the supermarket or sexual assault in the supermarket, right? This creates safer environments for these groups of people, which is primarily what our end goal seeks to have. However, on the on-site government, it is harder for them to monitor in real time when crimes occur.
Point of
And it's also
exclamation.
harder for them to have awareness of when these crimes are occurring. Therefore, vote side opposition. Thank you.
Thanks.
I think the point is that this debate is very unlikely about those kinds of heinous crimes and the delta they want to claim in that. Because it's rather unlikely that just an instance of facial recognition technology will be anywhere near effective in deterring those acts. They will just go somewhere else to do it. Furthermore, in our policy, we're completely fine with complying with existing norms such as the existence of CCTVs within the current supermarket premises. This debate is very much about how this acts of facial recognition technology will be used in the context of things such as shoplifting or things which the supermarket deems to be most likely by that context. So we think the majority of the case is probably not very realistic in terms of characterization. But now let's talk about three things in this speech. One, on the effectiveness of this solution. Secondly, why this immensely hurts the supermarkets. and thirdly, as to why this rather ambiguous policy engenders massive amounts of abuse. The first thing we talk about is the effectiveness of the solution. We agree that shoplifting in some nations, in some instances, might be quite problematic. But this debate is about why facial recognition technology, or whether facial recognition technology is the exclusive means to do so. And to that, Daniel already gives you lots of counter policy to prove that it isn't. We are fine with doing things like, for example, in the library, if you didn't borrow a book, there will be an alarm that sounds. We think that's probably much better at capturing the person, because when he runs up, there's alarms blaring, we can probably go after him. We're also fine with things like locking up expensive items behind glass panels. And if anything, we're also fine like policemen patrolling it if you're reading in like a massive ward where there's like kidnappings occurring in the supermarkets. The problem is all of these things can also achieve those same outcomes which they want to achieve. But the important thing is it does so at a significantly lower cost, which is something I'll elaborate on later. Because recognize that intuitively, facial recognition technology is quite inexpensive and oftentimes prohibitively expensive in the status quo. You need massive amounts of data, massive amounts of training sets. It's unclear why we need to invest so much money into that specific technology when there are already many established means to do it. Secondly, I even flip that claim and argue that facial recognition technology is less effective because it takes up the amounts of capital you would be otherwise spent on more targeted approaches. Because intrinsically, facial recognition technology is retroactive, which means only when a person has committed a crime, that means that you're able to detect them. But that also precludes you being able to detect and use the ability to detect many other people who are first-time offenders. So if anything, it's actually unreputable in this. Secondly, we posit there are also existing mechanisms such as CCTV footage, such as police officers who are actually able to mitigate against them. The third point we talk about is that they're really unwilling to bite the bullet here. They are saying if a person is a repeat offender, we have a staff monitor them. We do not want them to be banned from the supermarket. The realistic thing we want to question is to what extent can a supermarket with like very limited staff already engender this policy? We think that's unrealistic. The more likely scenario on their side will probably be an outright banning of these supermarkets, so we're willing to engage with the spectrum. So it's clear that in terms of effectiveness, facial recognition technology is not amazing, and it takes up lots of resources that could have went with other more effective means, as Daniel has given you. The second thing we talked about, which went unresponded to, is how this hurts the supermarket. Like the supermarket cannot sell as many things. This is because even if we buy all their arguments that this data or their assertions that these data would be reasonably used, recognize that it's not about how the data is actually used. It's how people think the data is being used. Now, if you're just an average Joe and you're going into going to Target in the United States, if you literally have to go there and scan your face, that's clearly a higher barrier of entry compared to if you just went into a supermarket with a basket and went on shopping. So it's clear that if you employ this technology at your supermarket, they will reduce the amount of patrons willing to come to you because it's very unlikely that people would just want to get their face scanned for like random reasons, right? And Daniel gives you the reason. It's because people intrinsically are quite risk averse against something which is as sensitive as their own identity, and they require quite a high burden of proof. For example, TSA, I think we all think it's reasonable, but we don't think it's reasonable that you have to scan your face just to go into a supermarket where items are typically quite cheap. It's unclear why scanning your face even does anything, and even if you're not an offender, you would still need to do it because as per its framing, you would need to scan everyone's faces to fill through and see who exactly is the offender and the accomplice. So it's clear that we will hurt on our side if we employ this technology with supermarkets. Third, then let's talk about the propensity for abuse. We posit, and our thesis is that ambiguity within the policy begets and engenders significant amounts of abuse. Because listen to that, in fact, read the motion states that you are allowed to match up against any past offenders or accomplices. It does not tell us how long these people would stay in the data set. Opposition didn't really give us an understanding. It also doesn't define to what extent will people be put into that system. So, for example, if you accidentally left like a bag of Mentos in your bag, would that get you through? The problem is that the amount of ambiguity within this current policy engenders things such as discrimination along racial lines. For example, it's a lot more likely for you to add in a black person who has stolen from your store compared to a white person because you might have forgiven him. It also, and this is extremely horrible, it also ensures that past offenders can never quite return to that same level of freedom which they ought have after they've already served their prison sentence or served their fines, for example. Because we think that supermarkets, I mean, quite trivially, are a place where a lot of people go to get their basic essentials like food and like things like that. And it's incredibly unjust to just make that inference that just because one person has stolen in the past, that he ought go through such a demeaning process of literally having to sell his own data at the expense of this nebulous idea of preventing crime. With that, I'll move into my substantive on why, quite frankly, we just make things more expensive. Now, I know this is not like a fancy argument, but I think we do have to acknowledge the fact that one, many supermarkets are operating on quite tight margins. They generally don't make a lot of money. They usually do their job for like the community almost. And secondly, that necessarily means that, and secondly, the fact that this sort of data sets would require massive amounts of capital. We're talking about literally in the millions of dollars, in fact, not even tens of millions of dollars. What this means is that the cost required to implement this sort of system doesn't actually match up with the amount of returns they can get, right? Because it's unclear and it's quite nebulous as to how a supermarket selling $1 fruits can somehow recoup that stolen cost. So what is most likely to happen is that a massive amount of cost will trickle down to customers. It looks like groceries getting a massive price hike. It looks like things like food and water being sold, having a massive markup because of the trickle down costs. And that's incredibly harmful because if you already consider things like societal factors like inflation and scarcity, that makes items even more expensive for the majority of individuals, which is something we're not willing to stand for. For those reasons, we're incredibly proud to do this.
One. So a couple of things I'll be doing in this debate before I start is that I'll be giving a couple of rebuttals and then I'll expand on my point on why implementing facial recognition technology is going to lead to a safer and supermarket and why it is justified. So firstly, I think in this debate, let's take a look at how this will actually happen, right? I think it's very unrealistic for government to come up and say that it's going to be like, you'll have to go through 5 or 10 minutes of like security check, right? I think what this more likely looks like is you walk into a supermarket, the CCTV camera just has facial ID checks, right? So that means when the camera is like recording your face and it has ID check and it matches your face with the pre-existing data in the system of past criminals who have committed crimes. And if you do match one of those faces, it will send an alert to the staff in the supermarket and then let them know, right? And we think that ambiguity is probably not going to be an issue because we think that to the point where this technology exists, if it can match up criminal profiles, it will probably either allow you to click into that profile and see what past crimes they have, or maybe have colors or symbols to represent the scale or the type of crimes these individuals have committed. And we think that if it's like not like a very strong crime, like you've stolen 5 or 10 years ago, it'll probably be like a orange scale, and then you'll probably just be extra monitored above how normal people would be monitored. Maybe staff will look out for what you're doing in those individual aisles, right? So we don't think it'll be to like the scale that government wants to claim, right? But more importantly, they want to say that this debate is not completely about the bigger scale crimes or like the more explicit crimes, right? However, we think that's not true. We think that the reason that we think this is also about crimes like SA, crimes like sexual crimes like maybe like hurting someone, or maybe like committing like inappropriate acts in the supermarket is because these are crimes that are most likely less able to be detected with the pre-existing programs, right? And these are crimes that would benefit especially with the existence of these technology. And furthermore, we also think that these technology would also help a lot with the pre-existing technology. For example, staff parole or barcodes, right? Staffs can be more explicit in who to look out for with the existence of these technology.
Information.
Yes.
Apologies.
Yes. Oh no, you can take it. I prefer them verbally, so yeah, just ask.
Could you explain why exactly current systems of things like policing are insufficient to do the things you want?
Okay, so we do think that, we do agree to a certain degree that there will be policing, right? However, it's at the very moment that the crime happens, or at the very moment that a criminal enters the store, right? In the very explicit nature of crime, for example, if it's an SA or like a crime like implicit assault, right? It happens right on that very moment. And we would rather prefer a preventative method where we can avoid these crimes happening or be ready to combat these crimes right at the very moment, rather than have those crimes re-happen again and then have to call the police up to have them come in right after that offender re-offends the crime. And now, setting the clear differentiation when they bring up examples of Apple and data security, right? We think that your data wouldn't be like explicitly surveillance, and we don't think like that the store is going to keep a data on every single person who enters your store, right? And even if they do, it's not going to be that big. It's just going to be like your face. But we don't think they will. We don't think what most likely happens is that they'll only keep a record of those who have committed the crime. And then like the security camera will just detect everyone. It will just stop once it detected someone who has committed the crime. So it wouldn't be like them consistently monitoring and infringing on your individual freedom, right? And I think that's a very clear differentiation between that and Apple, which explicitly takes data on your personal information, your choices, your your search history, right? And very critical and sensitive information. Now, on to my first point. But before that, let me add on to what my first speaker has said a little bit. Why is it exclusive on outside the house, right? We think that on outside the house, one, repeated offenders are less likely to commit crimes because they know that they're being monitored. Two, individuals are less likely to commit crime in the very first place because they know that these data are going to be monitored, and when they do enter stores again, that they're going to face some level of discrimination and parole. And we think that it's no thank you. And we think that that's why. And exclusively, we do think this is going to be useful because a lot of people who commit crimes have specific reasons or tendency for committing crimes. For example, some people may have like financial needs or whatever reasons for like having to steal, right? Yes, we do agree that that's a real and valid reason. But as like a supermarket, we still wouldn't want to encourage that type of behavior, and we still wouldn't encourage stealing either ways, right? Or maybe some people are just not very good people and they have repeated tendencies of SAing children, or maybe like being mean or steal, like being racist towards people in the store, right? Because that's just in their nature and their tendency. They have higher likelihood of recommitting these crimes, which is exactly why we think that this crime preventative method is best able to prevent these types of crime and people from recommitting these type of crimes. And now on why it is justified. So 2 layers to this. First layer. Okay, last POI.
Like, according to what you say, if a person commits sexual assault at a supermarket, to what extent is he going to return after his 5-year jail sentence, go to the exact same supermarket and do the exact same thing?
Okay. We think that supermarkets, right, they're a pretty big chain. So they're probably going to share data on people who've committed on one chain with other chains. So it will prevent you from doing exactly that and going to a new chain of supermarket because they have shared data within that supermarket chain, right? And we think they have no extra incentive to leak these data anyways, because 3 things, right? Firstly, supermarkets are probably a pretty big and established company, so they really don't have any reason to exploit or try to like sell out your data because they also have an incentive to retain their reputation and keep a good reputation, right? And they want people to keep coming to their supermarket. So if news were to get leaked that they are selling data, they would be in a pretty uncomfortable situation. And 2, right? We think that they also just want to be like, their main incentive is probably just keeping people safe when they come to the supermarket. Now, back to my justification on why this is okay. We think that most people would probably much rather have these existing pre-measures and maybe have their face scanned if that means that they're going to have a much safer environment when they come to a supermarket, because it's a communal area and it's something that people regularly have to visit, and it's something that a lot of different groups of people visit. And overall, we think that communal safety is something that in both sides of the house we would probably prioritize over maybe just having a certain level of individual freedom infringed, right? It's just like how before we enter a school, we have to give our ID card so that they know who we are before we enter a school or enter certain places. We have to tell them our identity, sign our name. And we think this just shows how most people would be okay with trading a level of individual information just for safety. Thank you.
I have to point out that side opposition's case is essentially that this single face recognition software is going to single-handedly solve all the crime issues, and suddenly supermarkets are going to become a happy place where people of the community can go and hang out or do whatever. So firstly, we'd like to tell you that this comes with a massive trade-off of intensive surveillance of people and literally no privacy, right? Your data is probably going to get stolen. So they came out and told us that they came out and told us that they're not going to collect your data and your data isn't going to get stolen or sold. So firstly, I tell you that it's definitely going to happen. This data is so useful and valuable. For example, like analytics on purchases, shopping patterns, etc., that could be used to optimize sales, data that could be sold to big tech. The companies are massively incentivized to collect it for their profit, right? As you tell you, supermarkets are profit-driven. If they can increase their profits, they're going to do it. And so it's extremely useful, like knowing someone's shopping patterns, where they go and when, what they buy and how much of it, etc. It's extremely valuable information for things like advertising or for things like internal company things that they can do to optimize sales and purchases, right? Why do you think Amazon's advertising makes so much money? It's because they have so much data of what you buy, when you buy it, and what you're buying it for. And so they come out and told us that companies will not be incentivized to sell it because they're a big operation and it's going to damage trust. So firstly, we tell that big tech companies like Google, like the NHS in the UK, like Amazon, they're all massive companies with massive followings, and they still continue to collect data and sell it, right? And even though that it may damage their reputation, people are going to come back anyway. Like, let's say a supermarket sells your data that they collected through this facial recognition software. What are you going to do? Never go to the supermarket again? Obviously not, right? And so we tell that even if this may damage their reputation, most companies are going to see it as a valuable trade-off because of the sheer lucrativeness of this data. So yeah, just because it's sensitive doesn't mean companies are going to have comms while doing it. Tech companies have sold health data, browsing histories, etc., which are arguably all much more sensitive than what a person buys at a supermarket, and face little to no repercussions for doing it. Right? Just because Apple sells your data, it doesn't mean you're going to go buy doesn't mean you aren't going to go buy an iPhone. And just because Google sells your data doesn't mean you're going to delete all your Gmail accounts. So even on their best case, where companies are all angels and don't sell this data, there's always the potential for hacks or data breaches, right? No matter how well protected their data is. And so the immense value of this data, as I've really emphasized before, only increases incentives for people to try and hack it. This looks like people, hacking health services to steal people's health data to sell. This looks like all the data breaches that happen on a near weekly basis with big tech companies all over the world. We tell that this is only going to repeat on a larger scale when supermarkets all over the world collecting people's face data or collecting people's shopping patterns and selling it out or keeping it and getting it stolen. The impact of all of this is that people's privacy will be extremely heavily impacted, which is a harm in and of itself, as my first and second speaker have told you, right? It's going to make people feel scared to go into a supermarket because it makes you feel like you're being tracked, you're being watched. And secondly, it's likely that public trust in supermarkets will plunge after a few data-related incidents, yes?
Okay, if like CCTVs and other form of like measures can exist on your side of the house, and companies really do have that much incentive, why is there going to be no data exploitation or selling of data on your side of the house?
Because a mere CCTV does not have facial recognition. It does not know who's buying what and where. They only know like rough guesstimates of how many people are coming to our store, what the majority of these people are buying. And the crucial point is that this data is not personalized. It's not optimized to a specific person. It's only large general trends that companies have been collecting for decades, right? They're not going to know that John Doe is buying this, and this. They're going to know that a large amount of people are buying this, and maybe they should stock that more. What's uniquely harmful is on your side when you connect personalized data, when you can connect a specific person to what they want, to what they're buying, and you can sell this data to advertisers to specifically target them. All right, going on, their next main thrust of their case was that they'll prevent severe crimes and have a safe environment in supermarkets for community activities or something. So on our side, we've already shown you so many other ways to create a safe environment and prevent severe crimes, right? For example, security guards, normal CCTVs, etc., all of which are much less controversial and equally effective outcomes, as my first and second speakers already told you. And it's extremely unclear why this facial recognition CCTVs or whatever are going to any more effectively prevent crime. So firstly, first-time offenders, which for big severe crimes like shootings or mass assaults or whatever, are probably going to make up most of the offenders because people who have really committed really severe crimes before are probably going to still be in prison, are not going to be affected at all because then they won't be locked as a crime threat. They'll be treated as any other person, and it'll be the same on both sides, where people can only respond to it when it's already happened. And secondly, even if you see someone who's facing a system commit a crime, so what? You have gotten the same result from a CCTV monitored by a guard, and it's really a severe crime like a shooting or something. You wouldn't be able to deal with it anyway. Additionally, their point on how they make people feel monitored and this will prevent them from committing crime falls, because we also apply to outside when we have security guards and security cameras watching you. They're going to feel monitored as well, and you're not going to commit a crime unless you're really driven to do it. Thirdly, on how the other side has completely failed to respond to some of our points. So firstly, we told you that this is going to be extremely expensive and the cost is likely to be passed down to a consumer, right? So to the normal average consumer, if you go to the supermarket and see their prices have probably gone up by 50% because of the new fancy technology the company has involved, they're probably not going to like it a lot, even if the company tells you, oh, this will reduce crime, etc., especially because you probably know they are being watched by these new fancy cameras and they're probably going to sell your data. So this is extremely damaging, not just this is actually extremely damaging, not just to the reputation of the company, because obviously their customers aren't going to be happy with it, but to customers who now have to pay more for daily necessities, right? And what's so important about this is that going to a supermarket is something that everybody has to do. You need to go to a supermarket in most parts of the world to buy food, to eat, to put on the table. It's like a basic need, a basic necessity, and it shouldn't be something that should be affected by this program that's definitely going to be extremely expensive, and definitely the cost is going to be passed on to the consumer because the company isn't just going to absorb it, right? And so they've completely failed to respond to our point on how we raise the cost of basic needs for many people, impacting people who may not be able to afford it, for example. And secondly, they haven't responded to our point as to why not that currently available solutions are not effective enough. They just told us that we'll be more able to effectively monitor them, but they haven't explicitly told us why security guards or why security cameras manned by security guards will not be able to do the same thing, right? There's like literally no difference as to why having a special security camera with the ability to recognize faces wouldn't like do just as well as a normal security guard who's there on the scene and ready to stop crimes or report them if they see them in progress. And especially when you consider that like security guards are hiring security guards and deploying security cameras, it's probably going to be a lot cheaper than building up a whole new system from scratch, taking in all the data to refine it and like deploy it, which is probably going to cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions. They've given us no reason as to why we have to do this. We have to do this whole new thing just for like little to no benefit. And thirdly, they haven't given us any reason as to why they will not entrench stereotypes, right? As my first weekend brought to you, but how their system is probably going to make people more scared of ex-offenders, because just because you're an ex-offender, you're going to be locked in the system. Even if it's placed by severity, the mere fact that you can rob a store like 10 years ago or 20 years ago when you're young, and now when you walk to a store, you know and you feel they're being specially monitored by guards just because of one mistake you made when you're young, is something that cannot be avoided on their side. For all these reasons and more, side with us.
Do not let proposition compare their worlds to ours, because the context in which they're operating on do not exist. Let me just ask you, has anybody ever went onto sexualoffendersnearme.com? Well, I have, and we have seen that there are so many normal people who are revealed to be sexual offenders. At times, it can even be your average Joe that the second speaker of a proposition was talking about. He could be an offender, especially in places like the US, which is the second speaker of proposition used an example. Firstly, let me outline the burdens of this motion. So firstly, for proposition, they have to justify why protecting one's right to privacy, even though facial recognition is technology that we already use, is important for a less safe environment, which I will talk about more later. Additionally, on our side, we have justified and proven that this technology will help reduce crime in supermarkets, especially in preparing staffs and employees to be more prepared to act upon their any crimes that are being committed. At the end of the day, in the status quo, there's already much crime that is being committed. Although petty thief is also rampant, but there are also more severe crimes that that proposition are ignoring, in which our end goal for both sides is to make supermarkets a more safe communal place where everybody can just shop in and not be stressed all the time. So what are the key contentions in this debate? The first one that I would be talking about is what helps to lower crime more, which means like preventing crime, et cetera, et cetera. And the second one is about why it is justified, especially on safety and on regarding like freedom in supermarkets. So firstly, let me talk about what helps lower crime. The undeniable problem that both sides or the issue that both sides are seeing is that crime is extremely potent in its SQ, especially petty theft, right? But the first speaker's proposition's argument only stands on the assumption that this is the only crime that is happening in these supermarkets. But this is just not true, because as aforementioned, there's a lot more extreme crimes that are happening. Whilst, yes, even if this technology may infringe on people's right to privacy, their argument still falls on the fact that other crimes are also important. So let's weigh a little bit. I mean, privacy is important, but having a safe state is more important, because is privacy even important if the supermarkets aren't even a safe space? Therefore, this takes down the entire premise of their part. Additionally, or furthermore, we have stated that the data that is stored is only your face, or something that people show out, which is something people regularly show outside and on social media. While yes, the third speaker talked about how optimization and how there's an incentive to keep these information. Well, yeah, I mean, many supermarkets already use CCTV and even spreadsheets to monitor these patterns, especially the things that are being bought or the time that people are going in. And even if they do collect this facial recognition data, it isn't any different from status quo anyway, because we also stated that we don't collect data from non-offenders. And okay, sure, we are willing to bite the bullet, but we was about oh, if they abuse this, right? But then we could just create legislations for government to check the facial recognition technology that is used in the supermarkets regularly. For example, routine checks on technology that's being used, etc., and etc. So what does this mean on our side? It means that we're not only just protecting against crimes, but we are also telling employees to be alert about people who are like formal offenders or like formal sexual offenders. So let me continue rebuilding. As our first speaker said, and the third speaker of Proposition said, supermarkets are a place where kids go. It's this place where women go. It's a place where people are the most vulnerable. This means that there are two main cases here. In the first case, when offenders are there, it will allow the staff to protect the vulnerability of these people as it alerts them. But in the second case, in the case where crimes are committed and being caught in the act, there's an immediate response and a more likelihood of prevention compared to like policing, which may take long moments as like it's a long time, or security guards who are stationed mostly at the door and occupied to check with the shoplifting. So yes, although it won't solve like 100% of the time, this like technology acts as a preventative measure. I'll take your POI.
So it's a matter of whose characterization is more realistic. So can you explain why do you think it's more likely that there would be random sex offenders walking around into supermarkets and like school shooters with AR-15s going in, which will be stopped by a facial recognition technology?
I mean, sexual offenders or like sexual like harassment is already a problem that's really potent in society nowadays, right? And it's also like not something that a lot of people like it is not inherently displayed on like a person's appearance. Sometimes a person's appearance looks really normal, but sometimes they turn out to be sexual offenders or like yeah. So most of the time this will also like having this like database us to like allows like staff to be more able to look like determine and more like comfortably see like who are the actual sexual offenders that are walking in like supermarkets and all that. Okay. So what does this mean in terms of impact? It means that it makes people more comfortable to be walking in supermarkets. And in the long term, it also makes supermarkets more safe. And it starts to make like this facial technology to be a norm to be included in other places and increase the safety of other places as well. Now, on to my second point about why it is justified. I would first like to rebut some of their points about discrimination. Their point about discrimination is not true because, as our first speaker has stated, it doesn't alert everyone, but only the staff. And this is like done through like technology that we have seen before, like during COVID, when there was facial recognition technology to detect masks and all that, right? So even if we accept your best case, let's think about it. What are the main causes of discrimination? The main causes of discrimination is the innate stereotyping that people have, not just, oh, it's alerted, he's black, and that's what black people do, right? So what does this mean? It means that their point of like discrimination also exists on their side of the world, and like due to like stereotype and stigma, and this exclusive harm that they try to push on us fall. Secondly, on their point about backlash, this is also not true because it is said before that like supermarkets are announcing that they have installed this facial recognition technology. It means that so to a certain extent, it means that they have consented to it. And even if there is backlash due to privacy, we believe that with all the weighing I did aforementioned, it is more likely that they will have like not backlash, but the opposite of backlash, because it helps make supermarkets a more safe environment. So now let's weigh another thing about their point about economics. They talked about how economics and the raising of prices are going to like affect people and make them backlash, but which like money and safety, you'd more rather have safety, and that's just the money that their service is providing. Therefore, proud to oppose.
One main question before I just talk about my reply is the type of crimes that would happen. So I think this becomes a pretty big contention in this debate, whether it would be sexual assault crimes or everyday petty thieves. So yeah, we do agree that, of course, like on an everyday level, there would probably be more crimes of like everyday petty thieves or like, just stealing stuff rather than just like explicit like crimes of violence or sexual assault or more stronger crimes. However, we think it's important to note that these crimes do happen quite often and at a more often rate than people would normally expect. So we think that it's good to have these measures that like preventatively like combat these extremely well, which is what our side of the house provides, which is facial recognition technology, which kind of exclusively like is the only like tool that can uniquely kind of prevent people who recommit these crimes or have a likelihood of committing these crimes. Is the only they want to they want us to set a clear distinction. And yes, we have that clear distinction for you, that it's basically the only form of preventative crime measure that is existing that can kind of have data to support, right? Because we think that while on their side of the house, there are some other pre-existing measures. My first speakers already told you why it would be less efficient. And even if it is efficient, it would, with these pre-existing like measures, with the implementation of this new technology, it would just make that old technology a lot better. But the most important point that we should take this debate on is just simply the fact that these facial recognition technologies, like we explicitly tell you, right, that it allows people to like kind of scan people's faces, so and like allows a more centralized like sharing of information about who's committing what crime. So that allows it to be like how to say a preventative measure for people before they commit crimes in the very first place, because they are aware that these measures exist. They're less likely to do these things. And when they want to talk about cost, we think it's also important to note that in their world, if these measures don't exist and it's harder for people to narrow down, they would have to hire a lot more guards. They would have to have a lot more surveillance cameras. So overall, it would be equally as costly, if not more costly in the long run, to sustain their model, right? Okay, now let's tackle the second question, whether this is going to lead to an exploitation of data. We think that we were charitable enough when we tell you that companies are most likely not going to do this because they have a reputation incentive. And two, we think we were also pretty explicit with our model. And we think we were also pretty realistic when we tell you that most likely companies aren't going to give an explicit data on every action that is performed by these individuals, right? But more likely, facial recognition technology just recognizes the faces of these individuals if they have committed crimes in the past, using data of people who have committed crimes in the first place. Because we don't think like supermarkets have access to like everyone's birth certificate and who's who, right? But we think more likely they just have a list of people who have committed crimes. So like when someone commits crime, they take a note of their name, take a note of their face, and then keep that in the record. We think that's the more likely model, right? So we think that's one thing. And two thing, we think that we've already told you as well that it's a communal space. So more likely individuals would be willing to optimize a certain level of their individual information, or like have their faces tracked if that means they would be much safer. And if that means everybody would just question everybody less when they step into these spaces. So yeah, we think that was also kind of left unengaged by government, right? Instead, government wants to push this idea of like affordability and trickle-down economics, which we really don't think that's where this debate should happen, because if a supermarket is willing to implement this technology, they can afford it. And trust me, it's not going to make that spaghetti go up by $2 just because this technology is implemented. So with all that said, we are super proud to oppose.
Talk about it being supermarkets for us to debate about things like active shooters, because it's probably quite unlikely that you have an active shooter on the loose. And what's even worse is that the active shooter shot at that store and then he came back to that store. So I think that the first issue on their side is that case is quite very, very narrow and didn't really do a lot of the stuff that we talked about. And the second issue was they didn't really prove the exclusivity. Like the only thing I heard was for why police within the status quo, which exists in the majority of countries, is not good, is because there's no immediate response. Like, I'm not sure how facial recognition technology will get you an immediate response. Like, is it like we detect a returning offender, you automatically ask the clerks to like arrest him or something? I'm just very unclear as to why either of these solutions are exclusive, and I don't think it's necessarily in the spirit of the motion to debate this outside like the general context of whether facial recognition technology should be acceptable, but rather I think it's more appropriate to contextualize it in the context of what are the majority of the crimes that do indeed occur in supermarkets, and what indeed are the crimes that are most preventable by this technology. With that, let's just go through the debate. The first thing we want to talk about, and this is probably the most immediate response, which went unresponded to on their side, that people would have when you implement this technology, is either they just won't go to these supermarkets. Now, this argument does not have any premise than the fact that the data will be exploited in any way, but it's merely the fact that if I am literally going to a supermarket, something I go to like twice a week and thrice a week, doing something as simple as getting pieces of broccoli or oranges or whatever, it's probably quite horrible for me to have to go through a facial recognition process because it's such a fickle matter, and people would probably do things like use online shopping or something, or go to another supermarket without this convoluted technology, which is why we oppose the use of it, because it merely distracts from the ability for supermarkets to become a provider. And we think if definitely with the interest of the supermarkets, that will make absolutely no sense of the advent of this technology. The second thing we want to talk about, and the whole nebulous idea of safety. I think opposition's conception of safety is quite wayward, because what they really want to do is to, and this is by, I have no clue why the debate is about sex offenders, but by their language, they will not allow a person who has been somehow previously charged to enter a supermarket store, have to go through a store where he's being escorted by someone else. Imagine the shame of you receiving such an extent of extrajudicial punishment in front of hundreds of people shopping in at your neighborhood store. We don't think that is fair, and we don't think that supermarkets, especially being a third party, have a right to use these kinds of means to stop individuals. Recognize that the justice system occurs on either side of the house. So no matter what you do, you will probably receive the repercussions within the context of the justice system. This debate is about to what extent can supermarkets be entrusted to use this technology in the context to which we say it shouldn't be, and for what reason. The first is note that this technology would intrinsically be monitored by that supermarket in and of itself, because they're only entering the data from that store alone. What this means is that leaves massive propensity for acts of abuse to occur. The first thing we question is, to what extent do you trust the supermarket to retain all the data? Now, even if we assume that the supermarket has a really high and moral standard, it doesn't change the fact that this ability for you to be optional intrinsically results in things such as abuse. For example, the imprinting of only certain races into the data set because the person owning the store is a racist. Even if these things are quite unlikely, recognize that technology legitimizes already existing preconditions, and that's something we find incredibly harmful. Lastly and importantly, I also gave you the argument as to why this trickles down onto groceries, and I don't think that's something you can just deny and counter assert, or assert falsely, in reply and third. I think there is a very tangible cost towards this very prohibitively expensive technology, and that means when it's indeed implemented, those costs will probably trickle down onto consumers, and that's something we generally think is wrong. For those reasons, we agree that supermarkets should be an entity of the neighborhood, and we shouldn't allow facial recognition technology to bar individuals from entering on the basis. Very proud to propose.